What if a single sentence could destroy a billionaire? This question lingered like smoke over the velvet drapes and polished oak of the Marlowe Club, where New York City's elite gathered in curated silence to remind themselves they were untouchable. The Marlowe Club was more than a restaurant. It was a shrine to power. Its chandeliers spilled golden light over tables dressed in white linen and crowned with wine glasses that gleamed like crystal bells. The clink of cutlery was soft, the music a low murmur, the air heavy with truffle oil and the perfume of fortunes earned in boardrooms and battles most ordinary people would never hear about.
What are you doing?
On this evening, every eye seemed to create its best point. The song How they are resourced to them as a dimension contra delining single in the sentence that selves dealing with selves encarns all Lincoln grows and the series. The own resource is much startling times to May the foliore. The one time will well disstate the New York Club, this song has the company relinquishing by computer or billionaire. The leaders that is amply managed to get in terms themselves on the centive counters. The part on the bottom series is so to work about is studio and 2 month is only part busy bee 2 month cold, and the time gold. Every eye seemed to find its way eventually to the corner table, the gravitational center of the room. It was there that Adrian Voss sat unmoving, except for the occasional twitch of his silver brow or the calculated tilt of his champagne flute. He was 67, and though his body was wrapped in the well-tailored armor of a Tom Ford suit, his
authentic clothing was reputation. He was a man who could tilt markets with a whisper, who had stripped companies down to bones and sold them off like carrion for decades. To many in the room, he was not so much a guest as a living monument to predatory capitalism. The younger man across from him was Ethan Ward, junior vice president at Voss Capital. He was 32, eager, brittle in his smile. Every word from Voss was met with a nod, every pause with a nervous laugh. Ethan clutched at his utensils as if they might anchor him through the storm that could come at any moment. His voice was always too loud, his praise too desperate. He was like a moth in orbit around a flame, not realizing that the heat would consume him.
The waiter glided past tables of murmuring patrons, but it was the waitress who approached Voss' table with a stillness that suggested both training and exhaustion. Her name was Clara Reed, though none of the patrons knew it, and certainly Voss did not. She carried herself with a grace that belonged to another world, one where her nights were not spent balancing trays and dodging careless elbows. Her dark eyes caught the light of the chandeliers with a quiet fire that no uniform could dim. Clara was 20. She lived in a Queen's apartment where schematics and half-finished prototypes covered her desk long after her shifts ended. She was a mechanical engineering prodigy, or at least that was the word used by professors who saw her designs and marveled at her vision. Still, brilliance did not pay rent and did not erase the debt left behind by a father swallowed by the system. Adrian Voss embodied. So Clara carried plates, smiled at strangers and learned to move invisibly through the world that had destroyed her family. The Marlowe Club that night pulsed with unspoken rituals. Conversations were muted whenever Voss shifted in his seat. Waiters adjusted their pace to avoid drawing his eye. Ethan spoke in half sentences, waiting for the nod of approval that rarely came. Adrian Voss himself was a sculpture carved from ambition. His face bore the roadmap of ruthless decisions, eyes like polished steel, jawline tight with disdain for anything he deemed beneath him. He sipped his wine with deliberate slowness, as though every bubble of champagne was proof of his supremacy. The room seemed to bend to him. The maitre d', Mr. Dubois,
An elegant man with years of service knew to hover at just the proper distance, never too close or far. He had seen countless magnates pass through these doors. Still, Voss was different. Voss carried storms in his pocket, and to anger him was to risk ruin for anyone nearby. So, when Clara approached to refill his glass, there was a tremor in the air that had not yet been seen but felt like the static before lightning. Ethan leaned in too quickly, his elbow nearly striking the silver bucket that held the bottle of chilled wine. He laughed about market volatility, his words tumbling over themselves, desperate to distract from the fact that he had nothing to say. Voss barely looked at him. He muttered, "The Henderson deal is dead," in a voice that carried like thunder through the hushed dining room. The words dropped like a stone. Ethan paled and scrambled to echo back outrage. "Unbelievable, sir. Disgraceful. Disgraceful that after all your work they would retreat." Voss regarded him the way one might consider a dog barking at shadows. He swirled his champagne and studied the bubbles with more interest than he had given Ethan.
Then, with a flick of his wrist, he dismissed not just the deal, not just Ethan, but the entire world outside his orbit. "A temporary inconvenience," he said coldly, "but it has soured my mood." Clara reached for the bottle, her hand steady, though her pulse quickened. The cool metal against her palm was grounding. She tipped the bottle toward the glass, her posture professional, her voice calm, as she quietly asked, "For more wine, sir." She was only part of the furniture for a moment, another servant in the gilded machine. But the air was charged. Ethan gestured too wildly. His elbow collided with Clara's arm. The bottle tilted, heavy liquid cascading across the pristine tablecloth and splashing onto the sleeve of Voss's suit. For a heartbeat, the club was silent. Every fork hovered midair. Every whisper froze. Voss looked down at the spreading stain. The cloth darkened. The droplets clung like blood to the grey of his jacket. His stillness was terrible, more dangerous than shouting. His eyes rose at last, locking onto Clara. Her hand trembled, though she forced it to be still. The silence stretched and deepened until the entire room was holding its breath. It was in this silence that the question hovered again. What if a single sentence could destroy a billionaire? The answer had not yet been spoken, but the room sensed the possibility. Like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, it waited to break. It waited for Clara Reed to speak. She said nothing yet, only meeting his gaze, eyes steady, and her breathing controlled. Voss began slowly, words sharp with venom. "You clumsy fool." His voice rose, slicing through the luxury of the dining room. The diners at nearby tables shifted uneasily, forks set down, wine forgotten. "Do you know what this suit costs?" he demanded, as though the price tag itself were sacred scripture. Clara opened her mouth, but he cut across her voice, growing louder, sharper. "This suit costs more than you make in 6 months.
This meal costs more than your rent." He towered over her, the figure of an apex predator, proving to every witness that he was the ruler of this gilded cage. The humiliation was thick and tangible. Clara stood motionless, pale but unflinching. Around them, the Marlowe Club fell utterly silent. The chandeliers flickered as if the air itself recoiled. Whether a single sentence could destroy him had not yet found its answer. Still, the stage was set, the audience primed, and the players ready. Adrian Voss, the Titan, and Clara Reed, the quiet prodigy,
bound by a past neither had yet spoken, were now locked in the orbit of a storm that would shake every wall of the Marlowe Club and echo far beyond its mahogany doors. The glass tilted further than it should have, the wine spilling slowly across the linen like molten gold running wild. Clara Reed tried to correct it.
Still, the force of Ethan Ward's clumsy elbow sent the bottle tumbling forward in her grip. The cold stream ran unchecked across the tablecloth, pulled and rolled, and then landed squarely on the tailored sleeve of Adrian Vaux's jacket. The splash was small by the scale of the city outside, yet in the insulated world of the Marlowe Club, it might as well have been a cannon shot. Every conversation ceased. Forks hovered midair, eyes darted from crystal glasses to the corner table where the disaster had struck. The soft music dimmed into irrelevance. The Marlowe Club breathed as a single organism, waiting to see whether its most powerful guest would erupt.
Adrian Vos stared down at his sleeve. The fabric darkened, the scent of oak and citrus rising from the stain. His hand froze on the stem of his glass. His face did not yet shift, but in the unmoving mask of that moment was the signal of a storm. His silence lasted 5 seconds, long enough for Ethan Ward to blanch pale, sufficient to resemble porcelain, long sufficient for Clara to feel the weight of every eye in the room crushing her shoulders. Then, slowly and deliberately, Voss raised his head. His gaze was like granite, cold, unyielding. He found Clara standing rigid, the bottle still in her hand, trembling against the silver rim of the bucket. She tried to speak, still her voice caught him. He inhaled deeply, the sound sharp and decisive. "You clumsy little fool," he said, low and dangerous. The words were daggers that pierced the room. The air grew taut and the chandeliers overhead seemed to dim.
Mr. Dubois, the maitre d', moved swiftly, his polished shoes gliding across the floor. His face bore the professional panic of one who must shield gods from mortal mistakes. "Mr. Foss, please allow me to handle this. The restaurant will of course pay for cleaning, any cost, any expense." But Adrian waved him off with a slash of his hand, still locked onto Clara. "I do not want money. I want competence," he said, his voice now climbing from a rumble to a growl. Eastie's chair scraped violently against the parquet floor as he rose to his full height. Tall, broad-shouldered, framed by wealth and decades of domination, he towered above Clara. She was slight, slender, framed in her neat uniform, yet there was something unyielding in the stillness of her face. Voss leaned closer, his breath heavy with wine and fury. "Incompetence is not an accident," he snarled. "It's a flaw of character. People like you drift through life, spilling, breaking, destroying everything you touch, leaving others to clean the mess. You are a drain on the system." Ethan Ward shrank into his chair, wishing he could dissolve into nothingness. His lips parted to speak some fumbling defense of the waitress, but no sound emerged. He stared at his plate, the filet mignon cooling, forgotten. Clara, however, held her ground, though her pulse raced in her ears. "I am sorry, sir," she said finally, her voice tight. "It was an accident." And Voss seized upon the word. He barked, "Accidents are for children."
For the weak, this is negligence. This is your nature. This is proof that the world is drowning in incompetence.
He raised his voice, now loud enough for the chandeliers to tremble. Every ear in the room caught his words, and every diner became a witness to the humiliation. Clara felt heat rising in her face. The bottle in her hand seemed suddenly immense, an anchor pulling her down. Yet she did not look away. Her eyes held his, and in them was no collapse, no begging, only a quiet stillness, growing colder by the second. Misleading. Mr. Dubois tried again,
"Sir, please, this is a misunderstanding. The restaurant accepts full responsibility." But Voss ignored him, his voice a whip, striking Clara repeatedly. "You make less in a year than this meal costs. You are nothing, yet you stand spilling wine on me, my work, and my name." Bold words rippled outward, filling the chamber of the club. Diners shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their plates. Others watched with morbid fascination. The spectacle of Adrian Voss crushing a server became its own kind of theater. Clara knew it. She could feel the audience feel the humiliation thick enough to choke. She steadied herself and carefully placed the bottle back into its pocket. Her hand no longer trembled. She inhaled the heavy scent of truffle oil and Bordeaux and lifted her chin. Voss loomed above her, expecting collapse, waiting for tears. He wanted her to crack, to beg to become another broken life beneath his heel. The silence thickened then. Clara opened her mouth. She did not raise her voice, yet every corner of the club would hear when she finally spoke. Still in this suspended moment, before words, she felt the gravity of her entire life pressing against her chest. The memory of nights in Queens, bent over schematics, the sound of her mother's weary sighs, the image of her father's hands stained with ink and hope. Adrian Voss stared into her eyes, and for the first time in years, he saw not fear, but something older, something unyielding. The storm he had summoned was about to break. He did not know that the lightning would not strike her, but him. The room held its breath. The diners leaned forward, forks forgotten. Clara Reed exhaled, and the world shifted toward the brink of revelation. The wine still glistened on Adrian Voss's sleeve, the stain dark as a wound. Still, no one in the Marlowe Club dared move. The chandeliers hung silent, the air thick with the perfume of truffles and fear. Ethan Ward sat hunched, shoulders drawn as if bracing for thunder. The maître d' hovered helplessly, lips parted to intervene, but rooted in place.
The other patrons watched in morbid fascination, eyes flicking between the predator and the girl, standing her ground. Clara Reed breathed once, slowly steadying herself. She placed the bottle in the silver bucket, her fingers no longer trembling. She lifted her head and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had reduced so many lives to ruins. She did not flinch. She did not bow. And then she spoke. "My father's name was Daniel Reed." The words were quiet, yet they struck the room like a hammer. Silence fell so complete it pressed against the skin. Every diner stiffened, and forks clattered against porcelain. A woman gasped softly. Voss froze, the insult rising in his throat, collapsing into nothing. He narrowed his eyes, a flicker of confusion passing over his face, as though the name were foreign nonsense. "What did you say?" he asked, low and sharp, as if each syllable were a blade. Clara took one measured step forward, closing the space between them. Her chin rose, the fear that had shadowed her features, melting into something else, something more challenging, fiercer. "Daniel Reed," she said again, slower now, each sound deliberate. "He was my father." Voss stared her down, searching for weakness. Yet something in her voice, in the icy clarity of her eyes, stopped him. The name began to echo through the halls of his memory, unfamiliar at first, then faintly resonant. But Clara did not wait. She pressed forward her words, weighted with years of grief and fury. "He remembered your face until the day he took his own life." Louder. Plates shifted in nervous hands. Murmurs rippled around the room. Mr. Dubois went pale, his professionalism cracking. Ethan Ward looked as though he had seen a ghost. His mouth opened, closed,
then hung slack. Voss, however, did not move. His face lost its flush, drained of color, until he stood grey as stone. His lips parted, but no words came. Clara continued her voice, low but caring, to every corner of the gilded chamber. You destroyed him. You took his company, dream and dignity, and when nothing was left, you left him with the memory of your face. That was the last thing he carried to the bridge that night. The patrons, who had once come only to taste Bordeaux and foie gras, now leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. They were witnesses to a reckoning that none of them had expected. A titan of finance stood revealed not as invincible, but as mortal, confronted by the ghost of a man he had thought forgotten. Voss staggered back half a step as if her words had physical weight. His hands twitched against the table's edge. His eyes darted, searching for escape. Clara stood unyielding, her voice slicing through his defenses like glass against stone. He was not just a number on your balance sheet. He was a man. He was my father, and you broke him. The silence deepened, heavy and oppressive. The club was no longer his domain, the cathedral of his supremacy. It was a courtroom, and every gaze was a jury. He wanted to summon rage, lash out and shout her down, but the words would not come. They tangled in his throat, strangled by memory. Because now he remembered. Read Innovations. The little tech firm, the ambitious patent the face of an inventor across a boardroom table. He had dismissed him, mocked him, buried his work beneath legal battles and hostile acquisitions. He had called him a fool. He had enjoyed it. He had won. And weeks later, the obituary had been nothing more than a footnote, a suicide in New Jersey, insignificant against the tide of his empire. But standing before him was no footnote. Standing before him was the living consequence, the child grown into a woman who had carried that loss every day for 15 years. Clara Reed, the waitress with fire in her eyes, had spoken the one sentence that tore down the fortress of his denial. The spell of silence stretched until it suffocated. A fork slipped from some forgotten hand, clattering loudly in the stillness. Voss jerked at the sound. His chest heaved shallow, his eyes wide, the mask of arrogance cracking. Clara held his gaze, refusing to release him, refusing to grant escape. She let the silence deepen until every heartbeat in the room drummed against it. Then she delivered the final strike. Her words were precise, unflinching. My father believed his invention could change the world. You destroyed it, not because it failed, but because it threatened your wealth. You buried it, and you buried him, but you did not bury me. Disregards shifted, a wave of whispers spreading like fire. Someone rose from their seat, unable to bear the tension. Mr. Dubois raised a hand, futilely begging for calm. The club trembled with the weight of revelation. Adrian Voss, the man who devoured empires, stood stripped of power, his kingdom annihilated by 7 words. Clara did not move. She allowed the silence to consume him, to expose him. She could feel her pulse hammering in her chest, but outwardly she was stone. Her voice had become her father's voice, his dream resurrected, his pain given form. She had made him face what he had done for the first time in her life. Adrian Voss turned away suddenly as though struck. He did not speak, did not defend, did not rage. He pivoted, stiffly pushed past Mr. Dubois, who tried weakly to catch his arm, and stoned toward the heavy oak doors. His footsteps cracked against the floor, each one hollow. Each patron turned their eyes, following him as he fled. The doors groaned open, then slammed behind them. The spell broke. Conversations erupted. Gasps spilled like thunder. Clara stood trembling, now the adrenaline crashing through her body. Her hands shook, her knees weakened. Mr. Dubois rushed to her, his voice soft. "Clara, come with me, please." But she did not move immediately.
She looked at the door where Adrian had vanished and knew the ghost of Daniel Reed had finally been heard.
The Marlowe Club no longer felt like a temple of power. It felt like a battlefield, scorched, silent, shaken. Every diner who had seen it would leave whispering. Every whisper would become a story, and every story would begin Adrian Boss's undoing. Clara inhaled once more, closed her eyes, and whispered almost too softly for anyone but herself to hear. "That was for you, Dad." And then, at last, she allowed Mr. Dubois to guide her away, her body shaking, but her spirit unbroken. The sentence had been spoken, and the empire of Adrian Voss had begun to fall.
The oak doors closed behind Adrian Voss with a violent thud that echoed through the Marlowe Club like a gunshot, and the silence he left behind was almost unbearable. The diners broke from their trance in hushed whispers, voices tumbling over one another in disbelief. No one had ever seen the Titan flee. Not from regulators, not from competitors, not from anyone. Yet a single waitress had driven him out into the night. Clara Reed stood in the eye of the storm, her body trembling as the adrenaline bled from her veins. Her knees felt weak, her breath shallow. She clutched the edge of the nearest table for balance as Mr. Dubois appeared at her side, his face a mask of professional sympathy and dread. "Miss Reed, please come with me." His voice was low, urgent. "The restaurant will handle this." She let him guide her through the narrow passage behind the dining room, past the polished mirrors and velvet curtains into the staff corridor, where the glow of chandeliers gave way to dim fluorescent lights. The clatter of the kitchen reached her, the hiss of pans, the voices of chefs whispering her name with disbelief. She felt dozens of eyes on her, but none dared speak as she walked by. Presumption. In the cramped office at the back, Mr. Dubois closed the door with a heavy sigh. The room smelled of paper, ink, and faint cologne. He sat behind his desk, fingers stippled. Clara remained standing, her hands balled into fists by her sides. She expected gratitude, or at least understanding. Instead, Dubois spoke with regretful finality. "Clara, you know what must happen." Hard. Already her heart knew, but she forced herself to ask. "What do you mean?" He avoided her gaze, smoothing a stack of papers on his desk. "Mr. Voss is one of our most essential patrons. After tonight, I have no choice but to let you go." The words fell like stones. For a moment, the air thickened around her. She had not expected mercy, but hearing the dismissal still cut deep. Her job was gone, and her income was severed because she had spoken the truth and dared to stand. She nodded slowly, her voice even. "I understand." Dubois pushed an envelope across the desk. It was thick, heavier than she expected. Inside was her final pay, a generous severance and more than that. A bonus meant not as reward but as hush money. He looked at her with a sorrowful expression. "What you did took courage, Clara. Many have wished to say those words to him, but none ever could. Still, the club cannot weather this storm with you here." Her fingers hovered above the envelope, then crinkled beneath her grip. The money would pay rent for months and cover tuition, yet it felt like ash in her hands. She slipped it into her bag without a word.
When she left the office, the staff parted silently. The clang of pots, the hiss of stoves resumed. But every glance that followed her was heavy with sympathy. She walked out through the back exit into the narrow alley. The night air was cold and sharp against her flushed skin. She leaned against the brick wall, closed her eyes, and let the moment's weight press down. For 15 years, the story of her father had been a silent burden carried in her chest. Daniel Reed had been more than a father. He had been her compass, her teacher, her hero. She remembered the smell of solder and ink in his workshop, the way he would hum while tinkering with wires and circuits, the light in his eyes when he spoke of changing the world with the kinetic core. She remembered, too, the silence that replaced that hum after Adrian Voss had torn everything apart. She had been 9 years old when the laughter stopped, when her mother began working 2 jobs, when debt collectors came knocking.
The memory rose with brutal clarity. The night she overheard her father speaking with her mother, his voice hollow. She had not understood every word. Still, she knew despair. She remembered the last hug, the whisper, "Be intense, my little Clara." Then the police car, the note, the grief that never left. She pressed her palms against her eyes, now fighting back tears. Tonight, for the first time, she had spoken his name aloud in the presence of the man who had destroyed him. She had seen Adrian Voss stumble, falter, break. She had given her father a voice. The chill of liberation mixed with fear. What now? She was jobless, adrift, with nothing but a thick envelope and the faint glow of defiance in her chest. Yet, beneath the fear, was something steadier, something more challenging. She had not merely confronted a man, she had cracked the facade of a god.
A far, far uptown. Adrian Voss stumbled from the glow of the Marlowe Club into the raw noise of New York traffic. The blast of horns, the rumble of engines, the shouts of pedestrians were jarring after the tomb-like silence he had fled. He moved stiffly, his driver rushing to open the limousine door. He collapsed inside the leather cocoon, hands shaking for the first time in decades. Arthur Reed. He muttered the name, scraping his throat like ash. His driver glanced in the mirror. "Sir, are you all right?" "Drive," Voss snapped, his voice breaking. The car carried him through the city, but his mind was stormed. Her eyes haunted him. Clara Reed's eyes. They were not simply hers, they were his. They were Daniel Reed's eyes, staring at him across time, across death. The words rang endlessly. He remembered your face until the day he took his own life. He pressed his palms into his temples, but the echo would not fade. At the same hour, in a different part of the city, Genevieve Hart sat in her apartment above a quiet street, scrolling absently through newsfeeds. She was a veteran journalist for the New York Sentinel, sharp, relentless, but tonight was meant to be rest, an anniversary dinner. She had been at the Marlowe Club. She had seen it all, the arrogance, the spill, the explosion, and the waitress who had whispered a name that turned steel into ash. She had not caught the words exactly, still she had seen their effect. A titan of Wall Street was brought to his knees, fleeing like a criminal. Her instincts prickled. Something. There was a story, not about spilled wine, not about service, but about secrets. She reached for her notepad, scribbled the name she thought she heard. Reed, then underlined it twice. She would dig. She always dug. Meanwhile, Back in the alley, Clara pushed away from the wall, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the faint neon glow at the street corner.
The envelope of money weighed in her bag, but it was still heavier, the knowledge that her father's ghost had spoken through her. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. She was no longer silent. She was no longer invisible. The fallout had begun. Adrian Voss, the man who believed himself untouchable, was unraveling Clara Reed, the woman he had sought to humiliate, and was free of her chains. For the first time in years, both predator and prey stood on the edge of transformation, neither yet knowing how far the fall or how fierce the storm to come would be. Clara walked the long avenue toward the subway, her bag heavy with the envelope that felt less like payment and more like a bribe to bury the truth. The night air was crisp, the hum of traffic weaving around her. Still, all she could hear were her words at the Marlowe Club. "My father's name was Daniel Reed." She whispered them again under her breath, not for the city, not for anyone who passed, but for herself, to remind her it had truly happened. For years she had carried the weight silently. Now it was out in the world. Her mind drifted back to the days before the silence, the days when laughter filled their modest home in Queens. Her father Daniel was a man of ink-stained hands and tireless imagination. He was no businessman. He did not wear custom suits or sip Bordeaux under crystal chandeliers. He wore flannel shirts smudged with graphite, his pockets stuffed with scraps of equations. He hummed to himself as he soldered wires. His daughter perched nearby, watching with wide eyes. His invention had been his pride and her wonder. The kinetic core, he called it, a device that could capture wasted energy from footsteps, from the vibration of subway trains, from the sway of tall buildings, and store it as usable electricity. Clara remembered the way he explained it kneeling beside her, with the prototype cradled in his palms. "Imagine every step you take lighting a lamp," he told her. "Imagine every train ride powering a hospital." She had giggled at the thought. He had smiled, a smile that carried both brilliance and hope. Reed Innovations was small and underfunded, but filled with life. Daniel and a handful of engineers worked late into the night, chasing a dream they believed could change the world. They did not have fortunes, but they had conviction. They thought the future could be brighter. Then Adrian Voss arrived. Voss Capital did not knock on the door seeking partnership. They came like a shadow, swallowing light. First came the purchase of debts from the banks, then the legal filings, patent lawsuits meant only to bleed Daniel dry. Then came the poaching of his engineers, with salaries he could never match. One by one, the team vanished, until Daniel was left nearly alone, fighting a battle that was never meant to be won. Clara remembered the change in her father. He stopped humming. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by exhaustion and quiet despair. The workshop grew silent, save for hushed phone calls filled with worry and pleading. She had been too young to understand the numbers, but she understood the slump of his shoulders and how her mother wept at night. The final board meeting was the breaking point. Clara had not been there. Still, her mother later told her the story. Daniel returned home late, his face hollow, his voice ragged. He recounted how Adrian Voss had sat across from him in his prime, a viper cloaked in silk. Voss had mocked him, called him a fool tinkering with toys unfit to run a lemonade stand, let alone a company. He had left while dismantling not just an invention, but the man who had created it. 2 months later, after the bankruptcy papers were filed, after they lost their home, Daniel drove to the George Washington Bridge. The note he left was short. "I am sorry." He took everything. "Be strong, my little Clara." She had been 9 years old when the police came. 9 when her world fractured into grief and death.
9 when her mother became both parent and survivor, working 2 jobs until her hands cracked and her health waned. Clara pressed her palms to her eyes as the memories surged against her. The night in the alley. The confrontation with Voss had been terrifying. Still, it was also liberation.
She had carried the ghost of Daniel Reed like a secret shackle for 15 years, and tonight she had spoken his name into the face of the man who ended him. It did not bring him back, but it gave him a voice. She boarded the subway, the train rattling beneath the city. Her reflection in the darkened window was pale, her eyes still burning. She thought of her mother, gone now after years of toil, who never saw justice. She thought of herself, a waitress by necessity, an engineer by calling, waiting for a chance that may never come. Yet something inside her felt lighter. She had faced the monster. She had spoken. Boiler's Adrian Voss sat in his penthouse, high above Central Park. The skyline glittered with the wealth he had built, yet he could not see it. His eyes were fixed on a single drop of wine still staining the sleeve of his suit. He had tried to scrub it away in fury. Still, the faint discoloration remained, a reminder of the moment when a waitress had unmade him. His hands shook as he poured a measure of scotch and swallowed it down, but the fire in his throat did nothing to quench the cold rising inside. Arthur Reed. The name clawed at his memory. He whispered it once, then again, until it felt familiar, until the echo became unbearable. He remembered the patent, the files, the smug satisfaction of tearing down a small firm before it could threaten his portfolio. He remembered mocking the man, his words cruel, calculated, and final. He had not thought of him in years. He had never thought of the daughter. Now the daughter stood before him, and her eyes had been mirrors of the man he had destroyed. He felt something he had not felt in decades. Dread, real dread, the kind that seeps into bones and robs a man of sleep. Elsewhere, Genevieve Hart returned from the club to her desk, unable to let the evening go. The story played repeatedly in her mind. A spilled bottle of wine, a billionaire's eruption, and then the waitress who had spoken a name. She had not heard it clearly, still
She had seen its power. It was not simply defiance. It was a revelation. She opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keys. Beckham. No. Adrian Voss. Adrian Voss. Confrontation. Waitress. Reed. She scribbled the name in her notebook and underlined it twice. Her instincts sharpened. There was something buried here, and she would dig it up. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her small apartment, schematics spread across the kitchen table. She pulled one toward her, a drawing of the kinetic core, a more advanced version she had been refining for years. The lines blurred with her tears. She traced the curve of a capacitor, the way her father once had. She whispered to the empty room, "I will not let it die, Dad." The ghost of Daniel Reed lingered not only in her memory, but now in the halls of power. His name, spoken aloud in a temple of wealth, had cracked open the carefully built walls of a billionaire. It was a beginning, a tremor before an earthquake. Clara knew that tonight had not ended anything. It had begun something vast and dangerous and necessary. She could feel it in her bones. Adrian Voss poured another drink, but the glass slipped in his shaking hand. The scotch splashed across the bar top. He cursed under his breath, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the shelves of bottles. For decades he had devoured others and felt nothing but triumph. Now a single sentence spoken by a young woman had dragged the dead back into his world. He could no longer pretend it was just business. He could no longer bury the memory with money. He was haunted. He knew the haunting had only begun. Clara finally lay down, though sleep did not come. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city around her, in the rhythm of subway trains, in the faint vibration of footsteps above, she imagined the energy her father once dreamed of capturing. The world was still full of power wasted, waiting to be transformed. She clenched her fist on the blanket. "Be strong," he had told her. She would be. She had no other choice. Thus, the night ended with two figures bound by the same ghost. One, a billionaire unraveling in his tower of glass. One, a young woman cradling blueprints in the dark. Each haunted, each changed, neither knowing how far the echo of Daniel Reed would reach, but both sure that the reckoning had just begun. Adrian Voss awoke before dawn, though the word awake was generous. He had not slept. He had paced the length of his penthouse until the soles of his shoes had left ghostly trails in the carpet. The city below still glittered in darkness, 1,000 windows shining with the wealth and struggle of millions. Still, he could not see it. He saw only her eyes, Clara Reed's eyes, eyes that did not belong to her alone, but to the man he had once mocked and buried. The name Daniel Reed gnawed at him. It circled back, no matter how hard he tried to shove it aside. He moved to the bar and poured Macallan into crystal, the sound of liquid against glass shaking in his hands. He swallowed and set the glass down. Too hard, the crack ringing in the silence. His reflection in the mirror behind the bottles was pale, older than he remembered. Sweat glistened at his hairline. He whispered to himself like a man in prayer, "Arthur Reed." His mouth twisted at the sound. He tried again, Daniel Reed. And then finally, Clara. The syllables were foreign enemies, unwanted companions in his skull. At 7, he called Philip Kane, his oldest confidant, his chief legal counsel, who had been with him from the beginning. Philip answered on the second ring, his voice composed and steady despite the early hour. "Adrian, you sound unwell. I need you to find something," Adrian said, his tone strained. "Find everything about a company called Reed Innovations. I acquired it around 2010. He paused, rubbing his temple. "I need to know what happened to the founder, Daniel Reed, and his family." There was silence on the line. Philip exhaled slowly. "That is a name I have not heard in a long time, Adrian." His tone carried caution. "The kinetic energy patent. I remember. What about it?" "Just find it," Adrian snapped, then lowered his voice, his throat raw. "Discreetly, Philip, please." Philip agreed with no further questions, though his silence said much. After the call, Adrian dropped into his leather chair staring at Central Park. The morning sun rose over the skyline, but there was no warmth for him. He felt stripped of his armor of money and certainty of control. At the same time, she thought of her mother, whose hands had grown raw from endless shifts to keep them alive. She thought of the eviction notices, the years of hunger, the shame that shadowed them. Yet, she also thought of the dream her father had breathed into every wire he touched. Clara would not let it die. She could not. So his ghost had spoken through her, and the city would not forget. Genevieve Hart typed furiously at her laptop in a small apartment near the East River. Her anniversary dinner had been ruined. However, she could not call it that now. She had been in the room at the Marlowe Club. She had seen the billionaire explode at a server. She had seen that waitress whisper something that turned him to stone. She had watched Adrian Voss flee like a criminal chased by nothing but words. Undermined their journalistic instincts, roared awake. That was not defiance alone. That was exposure. She played the scene over in her mind, trying to read the waitress' lips. The name she thought she saw was Reed. She scribbled it into her notebook, then circled it. She began with quick searches: Voss confrontation, Marlowe Club, Waitress, Reed. Nothing yet. The club was already sealing the cracks, wealthy patrons trained in silence. Still, Genevieve was relentless. She dialed the number. The busboy at the Marlowe Club answered groggily. "Hello, it's Hart from the Sentinel," she said briskly. "You remember me? You owe me." He hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, what do you need?" "Tell me what you heard last night. What was the name?" she said. There was a pause. Then, in a hushed whisper, Arthur Reed said, "Or maybe Daniel? Something Reed, I am sure, and the waitress, whose name was Maya, the daughter had faced him down in the temple of his own supremacy." This was not just a story. This was a reckoning. Back in the penthouse, Adrian Voss prowled the room, muttering to himself, fragments of memory returning. He saw again the boardroom where Daniel Reed had sat across from him, tired, desperate, yet still defending his invention. Voss had leaned back in his chair, dismissing him with a smirk. "It is a hobbyist's fantasy," he had declared. The words had echoed through the room, cruel and final. He remembered the engineers he had bought away with fat checks, the lawsuits filed with no merit but maximum cost. He remembered the satisfaction of watching Reed collapse. And yet, he also remembered the newspaper weeks later, a photo of Daniel with his daughter, young, smiling, bright eyes full of hope. A small line in a small paper. Local inventor dead in apparent suicide. Voss had skimmed it without thought at the time. Now the words burned. He felt as if that smile haunted him from every shadow. The day wore on, but he found no escape. His empire hummed around him, emails arriving, calls waiting, but he ignored them. All he could hear was her voice. My father's name was Daniel Reed. By noon, Philip Kane arrived at his office with a beige folder. He set it on the mahogany desk without a word. His face was grave. Adrian did not open it. He could not. Instead, he stared at it, as if it might hiss or strike. He whispered, "Not yet." Genevieve, meanwhile, had compiled enough to sketch the skeleton of her article. She saw the arc clearly. The ruthless acquisition, the tragedy, the daughter rising from the ashes to confront the predator. She tapped her pen against the desk. The headline was already forming in her mind. The Ghost of Marlowe Club. She knew, once published, it would ignite the city. That night, Clara sat at her desk, illuminated by a single lamp. She traced the lines of her father's invention. The prototype on the table was crude but functional. She had kept working on it, refining and improving. She murmured to the air, "I will finish it, Dad, I swear it." The city beyond her window roared with life, cabs honking, lights blazing. Yet she felt alone in a different current, as if carried by a force larger than herself. She closed her notebook and allowed herself to imagine survival and victory for the first time in years. Program as Adrian Voss stared out at the same city. He saw no victory, only shadows, only ghosts. The glass reflected his weary face. Behind it, another face emerged in the depths of memory. Daniel Reed's, and the eyes of a child who had grown into a woman strong enough to shatter him with words. The haunting had begun, and no wealth, no fortress could keep it out. Adrian Voss sat at his desk in the corner office of Voss Capital, staring at the skyline of Manhattan spread wide before him. The city glimmered with its usual confidence towers of glass and steel, catching the late afternoon sun. Yet for him there was no comfort in the familiar view. His reflection in the window looked older, gaunter. His shoulders slumped as though gravity had found new weight to lay upon him. The beige folder Philip Kane had delivered sat unopened on his desk. Its presence taunted him. He had demanded the truth, yet now feared the confirmation of it. His hand hovered above the cover, fingers trembling before it reached.
"You asked for this, Adrian," he said gently. "It will not get lighter by leaving it closed." Voss grunted and turned away, pouring another drink. Scotch sloshed into the glass. However, his hand shook so severely that some spilled onto the mahogany. He muttered, "She had his eyes. Philip." The girl looked at me, and it was him again. It was Reed. Philip studied him carefully, choosing words as if stepping across thin ice. "What you saw was a consequence of Adrian. You built an empire out of them. For the first time, one survived long enough to return." Opening. Ethan Ward slipped inside, holding a folder of reports. Adrian drained the glass, his throat burning. He turned back to Philip, his voice low, broken. "What do I do, Philip? What is left for me to do?" The older man leaned forward. "You have two choices. You can bury her, try to discredit her, ruin her as you have done to so many. Or you can finally face what you are, what you have done." Voss barked a bitter laugh. "The first choice is instinct. It is survival. The second is suicide." Philip shook his head. "No, Adrian. The second is the only path left for you. The world is changing. A story like this is not a storm you can buy your way through." Adrian pressed his palms into his eyes. The echoes of Clara's words still rang. He remembered your face until the day he took his own life. He could not escape them. Sleep had become impossible, food tasteless. Every shadow in his penthouse seemed to carry the shape of Daniel Reed. He felt hunted by the ghost of a man long buried. And worse, by the unflinching resolve of his daughter. At that same hour, Genevieve Hart sat in the newsroom of the New York Sentinel. The glow of her monitor painted her face sharp with focus. Her article was nearly finished. The headline burned across the screen. "The Ghost of Marlowe Club." She pieced together the story with precision. Every acquisition, every hostile tactic, every witness statement. She had quotes from former Reed engineers willing to speak anonymously about the relentless crushing of their company. She had Clara's words, breathed. Clara, meanwhile, sat in her apartment, her sketchbooks spread around her. The news of losing her job had reached friends who texted apologies, encouragement. She responded to none. Instead, she scribbled furiously, refining the capacitor model on the kinetic core. Her father's invention lived in these pages. She whispered to herself, as if to him, "I will finish it, Dad. They cannot bury it again. Not while I breathe." Back in his tower, Adrian Voss opened the folder at last. His eyes scanned the cold facts, the memos his younger self had written, the lawsuits, the acquisitions, the obituary clipped from a local paper. His hand stopped at the scanned image of a note. A short apology to a daughter. He read the final line again and again. "Be strong, my little Clara." The glass slipped from his hand, shattering, scotch pooling across the floor. His chest tightened. For the first time in decades, tears welled unbidden. He pressed the note to his chest and whispered into the empty office, "Forgive me," though he knew forgiveness would never come. The newsroom of the New York Sentinel buzzed with the electric hum of anticipation. Genevieve Hart leaned over her desk, eyes locked on the glowing screen before her. Her fingers moved quickly, adjusting a sentence here, sharpening a phrase there. The story she had pieced together from whispers, documents,
and the unforgettable scene at the Marlowe Club had taken shape into something undeniable. She reread the headline, letting its weight settle. The Ghost of Marlowe Club. Did Adrian Voss drive an inventor to his death?
The article was more than a recounting of spilled wine and a billionaire's rage. It was a map drawn in blood and signatures from a decade of ruthless business. A line that began with Reed Innovations, a promising small firm with revolutionary technology, and ended with the suicide of its founder, Daniel Reed. Between those 2 points lay every cruel tactic, leveraged, death lawsuits, the deliberate poaching of engineers, and the crushing dismissal of a man's life's work. All of it tied directly to Adrian Voss. Genevieve had the receipts and anonymous testimonies from engineers who remembered their work stolen and then buried. Bank filings showed how debts had been strangled into collapse. Local papers with the obituary of Daniel Reed, a man forgotten outside his family. Finally, Clara's words were offered cautiously in their brief conversation after the confrontation. My father believed his invention could help people. Voss saw it only as a threat to his fortune. He didn't just bankrupt the company, he destroyed a good man. She hit publish and the article went live. Within minutes, it began to spread. The Sentinel pushed it across every platform. Social media caught the spark and fanned it into a blaze. Hashtags multiplied: Voss Ghost, Voss Truth, Reed Innovations. The story climbed trending lists. By evening, it was everywhere. Screens in cafes displayed the headline. Phones buzzed with notifications. Cable news anchors interrupted scheduled segments to cover the scandal. Synchronized the financial district, screens that usually flashed numbers now flickered red as Voss Capital stock began its descent. Investors panicked. Board members called each other in frantic whispers. Traders watched in disbelief as a single story was now devouring a man who once devoured markets.
Clara sat in her apartment when her phone began vibrating endlessly. Messages poured in from classmates, strangers, old neighbors. They had seen her name, seen her words. Her face was not yet everywhere, but the world knew her voice. She held the phone tightly, heart pounding. The story was out. The ghost of her father was no longer confined to her memory. It was marching across headlines for millions to see. At the same time, Adrian Voss stood in his office, staring at the television on the wall. His own face glared back at him, arrogant and powerful in photographs taken years before. Beside it, smaller and softer, was the face of Daniel Reed, smiling, hopeful. The caption beneath was merciless. Billionaire haunted by suicide linked to ruthless acquisition. The ticker at the bottom bled red as his empire lost value before his eyes. Renown turned to Philip Kane, who stood near the window, composed as ever. Voss's voice cracked. "We sue, we drag the Sentinel through the courts, we ruin the girl." Philip's reply was calm.
Precise on what grounds? Adrian, the facts are true. A lawsuit will drag every detail into the light under oath. Is that what you want? Voss stared at him, rage and dread warring in his eyes. He had built an empire on intimidation. Still, here it failed. For the first time, his wealth was not a weapon, but a spotlight. Elsewhere, Genevieve watched the analytics climb. Her article was being read, shared and dissected. She received emails from lawyers, former employees, and even victims of other hostile takeovers, emboldened by the storm. She leaned back, exhausted yet triumphant. The story had broken free of her hands. It belonged to the world now. Clara closed her sketchbook that night and stood by her window. The city pulsed with light, the streets alive with horns and voices. Adrian Voss sat surrounded by ghosts somewhere in that chaos. But she felt no fear. She felt only resolve.
For 15 years she had carried silence. Tonight she carried truth, and truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. 2 days after the article set the city ablaze, Clara Reed sat at her small kitchen table, covered in sketches and scattered notebooks. The air smelled faintly of coffee gone cold, and the graphite smudges on her fingers marked hours of restless drawing. Her phone continued to buzz with messages from strangers, journalists, even old classmates. Most were supportive, some were invasive. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the blueprints before her. Her father's invention stared back at her, reborn through her own hand. The kinetic core was no longer just memory, it was purpose. A knock at the door startled her. She froze, pencil hovering in midair. The knock came again, steady, deliberate. She rose cautiously and opened it. On the other side stood an older man in an immaculate suit. His hair was silver, his expression tired, but his eyes carried a sharp clarity. "Miss Reed," he said gently. "My name is Philip Kane. I am legal counsel for Mr. Voss. May I have a word?" Clara's stomach tightened. Instinct screamed to shut the door, but something in his demeanor restrained her. He did not posture or loom. His presence was heavy, but not threatening. She stepped aside reluctantly. He entered with the measured grace of a man who had seen too many negotiations unfold in cramped rooms. He placed a sleek black briefcase on the coffee table, its polished surface reflecting the scattered sketches of the kinetic core.
"If you are here to threaten me, save your time," Clara said sharply. He lifted a hand. "Not at all." He clicked open the case. The sound was crisp, loud in the small room. Inside, on black velvet, lay a cashier's check. The zeros stretched across the page, dizzying. $10 million. Next to it lay a thick document stamped in bold letters. Confidential Settlement and Non-Disclosure Agreement. Clara inhaled sharply. 10 million. The figure echoed in her mind. It was enough to erase every debt, to finish her degree, to buy a home, never to work another night shift again. It was freedom. Yet, as she stared at the paper, the weight of it shifted into chains. Philip's voice was calm, measured. "This is not a threat, Miss Reed. It is an offer. A chance to move forward, to live without worry. All he asks is your discretion." Silence, Clara thought. That was the actual price. Not the money, not the paper, but her voice, her story, her father's name smothered again, this time not by lawsuits, but by her own consent. The temptation was suffocating. She thought of her mother's tired hands, the eviction notices, the hunger that shaped their childhood. She thought of what life could have been with this kind of money. Her gaze drifted to the sketches on the table, equations scrawled in the margins, notes she had written to herself. Dad would have liked this. She remembered her father's workshop, his voice explaining how every footstep could power a light. She saw him again, not broken, but alive, vibrant, dreaming. $10 million sat before her, but it felt like an insult compared to that dream. Undermined up at Philip, her voice was steady, though her chest pounded. "You can tell Mr. Voss that my father's life is not for sale." Philip studied her eyes for a long moment. He saw no hesitation, no negotiation, only conviction. Slowly, he closed the briefcase with a click. The sound was final. He stood. For the first time in decades, he felt something like respect for someone who refused the weapon he had wielded all his life. When he returned to the penthouse, Adrienne Voss paced like a caged predator. Did she sign? What was the number? His voice was urgent, brittle. Philip
set the briefcase on the bar. "There is no number." She refused. Voss scoffed. "Everyone has a price. You didn't offer enough. Go back with 20. Philip's reply was calm. It would not matter if it were 100. She looked at that check as if it were an insult. Voss froze, staring at his old friend. The realization hit him harder than any market crash. His wealth had failed. His power had been neutered by a young woman with nothing but resolve. He had tried to buy silence. Instead, she had given him judgment. He sank into his chair, hollow eyes fixed on the skyline. For the first time, he understood that his empire could not protect him from the truth.
The ghost of Daniel Reed was alive in his daughter, and no amount of money could bury it again.
Adrian Voss sat alone in his penthouse as twilight bled into night. The city beyond his glass walls sparkled with indifference. Still, he no longer felt its rhythm. The briefcase Philip Kane had returned with sat unopened on the bar, a symbol of failure. For the first time in his life, money had not been enough. He poured himself a drink and set it down untouched. His hands shook too much to lift it. The memory of Clara Reed's eyes lingered sharper than any market loss. Philip had told him the words she spoke. She said her father's life is not for sale. The sentence replayed over and over until it grew heavier than the silence around him. Voss rose and began to pace. He felt the weight of every acquisition, every ruin he had left behind. But this was different. This was not a faceless opponent on a balance sheet. This was a man, a daughter, a family. He had destroyed more than a company. He had extinguished hope. He moved to the desk where the beige folder lay, the one Philip had given him days earlier. He had skimmed it before. Still, now he forced himself to read every page. The acquisition documents cold and clinical, the memos he had signed off on with cruel efficiency, the lawsuits filed with no expectation of winning, only of draining Daniel Reed's resources. And finally, the clipped obituary, local inventor dead in apparent suicide. He paused, then turned to the final page. A scanned image of the police report. The last line of the note seared into him. "I am sorry, my little Clara. Be strong." Adrian dropped the paper as though it burned. His breath hitched ragged, his chest tightening. He lowered himself into the chair, pressing his face into his hands. For decades he had silenced conscience by telling himself it was business. But the words mocked him now. Business had stolen a life. Business had orphaned a child. Business had created the young woman who now stood unshaken before him. He whispered into the empty room, "Forgive me," though he knew forgiveness was beyond reach. The next morning, he called Philip to his office. Voss Capital was buzzing with panic.
Stock prices sliding, headlines multiplying. Analysts filled screens with speculation.
The empire trembled. Yet inside the office, the storm was personal. Voss spoke without preamble, arranged a meeting with her. Philip looked at him evenly.
Where?
"Neutral. No lawyers, no briefcases. Just me," Voss said, his voice cracked with something that might have been desperation. "She deserves to hear it from me." Philip studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I will try." Adrian exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. He turned back to the window, the city alive with a million lights, but all he saw was the ghost of Daniel Reed. That evening, Clara received a call. Philip's voice, calm, respectful. He explained that Adrian wanted to meet her, not to bargain, not to threaten, but to speak. She felt her chest tighten with fury and suspicion. "Why would I meet him?" she demanded. Philip's tone softened. Because he's finally ready to tell the truth. She nearly refused, yet a quiet voice inside urged her to hear it, to face him again on her terms. She agreed, but with conditions. A public place, neutral ground, no guards. They met the next day at the East River Pier under a slate-grey sky. The water churned, restless gulls crying above. Clara arrived first, standing against the railing, her hair pulled back, her face unreadable. She wore no uniform now, only a plain coat and scarf. When Adrian approached, he looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. He stopped a few feet away. "Miss Reed," he began. "Thank you for coming."
"I didn't come for an apology," she said flatly. "There isn't one big enough. I know." His voice broke. I read his note. I destroyed him. Not because he failed, but because he threatened my wealth. His invention was brilliant. I knew it was brilliant. That is why I buried it. He spat the word business like poison. It was cheaper to kill his dream than to risk my fortune. Clara felt fury and grief crash together inside her. Her voice trembled with restrained rage. It wasn't just a dream. It was him. You took his hope and it killed him. For what? Another zero on your portfolio? Voss nodded, shame carving lines deeper into his face. Yes, and it is the significant root of my life. The wind tore at them, the river swelling dark beneath. Adrian's confession hung in the air. Clara turned away, tears pricking her eyes. His words did not heal, they did not restore, but they revealed. The monster, stripped of arrogance, Adrian Voss had finally admitted what she had always known. The truth was out, spoken, not by a daughter, but by the man who committed the crime. And though forgiveness was impossible, the confession was a weight, shifted from silence to light, a wound still open, but no longer hidden. The wind along the East River cut sharp against Clara's face as she stood across from Adrian Voss. His confession still hung between them, raw and jagged like glass. The man before her was no longer the unshakable titan of Wall Street, but a weary figure stripped of armor. His eyes no longer blazed with arrogance. They sagged, heavy with something closer to grief. Yet grief was not absolution. Clara's voice trembled, but her words were steel. My father's invention was not just a machine. It was his life. It was our future. You buried it in the ground like it was nothing. You think words now will change that? Voss flinched, but did not turn away. I do not expect forgiveness. I cannot ask it. What I can do is this. He drew a breath, steadying himself. Let me help you bring it back. She blinked, startled by the proposal. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Help me? You destroyed him. Now you want to attach your name to his work? Never. Voss shook his head fiercely. Not my name, not my control. I am not asking to own it. I am asking for funding. You will lead it. You will be the architect. The company will bear your father's name. Reed Industries. The offer twisted inside her. It sounded like restitution, yet her heart recoiled. Suspicion burned. What would stop you from stealing it again? From burying it if it threatens another of your empires? His voice cracked. This is no empire, Miss Reed. This is penance. I have built a fortune on destruction. Perhaps the only way left to me is to use it to build. Clara turned back to the river, her hands gripping the cold railing. Her mind swirled with images. Her father smiled over a prototype. Her mother was counting pennies at the kitchen table. The years of silence and struggle. The check for $10 million she had refused. And now this, a chance not to silence her, but to amplify her,
to resurrect what her father had given the world. She spoke without looking at him. My father once told me that every step, every vibration, every wasted motion carried energy waiting to be captured. He believed people could walk through a city that powered itself. You killed that dream, he said quietly. Then, let me help you resurrect it. The silence stretched heavy with gull cries and waves lapping against pylons. Clara's chest rose and fell with deep, unsteady breaths. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. If this happens, it will be mine, not yours, not your company. Mine. You will fund it.
Then you will stay out of the way. Voss nodded instantly. Absolute control will be yours. Reed Industries will be yours. I will be only a silent partner. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of salt and oil. Clara studied him, seeing the sincerity etched into his weathered face. For the first time, she wondered if he truly grasped what his empire had cost. It may not matter. Her father's dream mattered more. She whispered, "Then I will rebuild it. Not for you, not for your guilt. For him and the world."
3 years later, headlines blazed across every major outlet. Reed Industries unveils revolutionary Reed Core green cities of the future. The invention her father once nurtured in a cluttered garage now stood at the center of a global movement. Cities embedded the technology into sidewalks and subway platforms. Skyscrapers generated their own power. Streets lit themselves with the footsteps of the people. Clara Reed became a name on magazine covers.
Wired, Forbes, and Time hailed her as a visionary, an engineer who had turned tragedy into triumph. Reed Industries was built differently. Its majority shareholder was a charitable trust funding scholarships for underprivileged students. Its profits were reinvested in research and clean energy. The ghost of Daniel Reed lived on, not as a tragedy but as a beacon. And in the boardroom at the edge of every lunch sat Adrian Voss, silent, silver-haired. He never claimed credit, never sought the spotlight. He opened doors where she needed them and offered guidance only when asked. To the world he was retired. To her he was penance. They were not much between them. Still, they were partners bound by fire, one that had destroyed and one that had rebuilt. Sometimes when she caught him watching from the back of a crowded room, she thought she saw not happiness, but something quieter, a kind of peace. She never offered him forgiveness, but she allowed him this one truth. He had tried to erase Daniel Reed. Instead, he had resurrected him. And in that resurrection, Clara found not closure, but continuation. An inheritance of fire passed from father to daughter, burning now bright enough to light the world. The launch of Reed Industries became more than a business story. It became a cultural moment. Cities across the world lit up with demonstrations of the Reed Core. Sidewalks glowed under the pressure of footsteps. Subways powered their own lights. Skyscrapers shimmered with captured energy. Entire neighborhoods, once strangled by high costs of electricity, now hummed with clean power. The invention that had nearly been lost forever rose again, not as a footnote, but as a revolution. Clara Reed stood at the center of it all. Her image appeared on magazine covers. Her speeches went viral across social platforms. Universities called her a pioneer, governments called her a partner. The young woman who had once poured wine in silence now commanded stages filled with world leaders and engineers. Yet behind the acclaim she remained grounded. Every design meeting still marked with notes in her father's handwriting, phrases she had copied from his old journals. Every blueprint bore his spirit. For Adrian Voss, the transformation was quieter. He had stepped down from Voss Capital, retreating from the empire he had once ruled with iron will. To the public, it was retirement, a graceful exit for an aging billionaire. To those who knew the truth, it was exile, chosen and deserved. He poured his resources into Reed Industries but remained in the shadows, never demanding credit, attaching his name. He had spent a lifetime burying others. Now his final years were spent ensuring that Daniel Reed's name would never be buried again. Their relationship remained complex. Clara could not forgive him. The weight of her father's absence was too deep, the years of struggle too sharp. Yet she acknowledged him. They met occasionally in quiet conference rooms or during late-night phone calls to discuss logistics. Sometimes, after a major success, she would see him standing at the back of the crowd, his expression unreadable. Still, his presence was steady.
He never smiled broadly, but there was a glimmer in his eyes, something between sorrow and peace. One evening after a global summit, Clara walked alone along the river, where years earlier she had first confronted him. The wind carried the same chill, but now she stood taller, her name and her father's carved into history. She thought of the moment in the Marlowe Club when she had spoken those 7 words that shattered an empire. My father's name was Daniel Reed. That single sentence had rippled outward until it transformed not just her life, but the world. She understood now that truth was power, not the kind bought with money or enforced with fear, but the kind that endures. This pier, weeks later, alone. The city skyline stretched before him, a monument of glass and ambition. He thought of Daniel Reed, the man he had mocked and crushed. He thought of Clara, the woman who had risen from the wreckage. He knew his wealth could never buy redemption.
Still, it could build restitution.
He whispered into the wind, I destroyed him, but I helped her create. He knew it was not enough, but it was something. As the years passed, Reed Industries flourished. Entire generations would grow up walking streets that powered themselves, sitting in classrooms funded by scholarships under the name Daniel Reed. For every light that flickered on, for every student who opened a textbook bought by the trust, a piece of Daniel lived again. His ghost no longer haunted it, it guided. Plastics. Clara often told young engineers that invention was not only about machines, but about memory. Every circuit, every capacitor was a vessel for the hopes of those who came before. She never let her father's story fade. She told it openly, not as tragedy alone, but as proof that truth could rise from the ashes of ruin. Nissan saw the story ended not in silence, but in resonance. A billionaire who once devoured dreams spent his last years protecting one. A daughter who had carried grief like chains transformed it into fire that lit the world. The legacy of Daniel Reed was no longer buried under contracts and lawsuits. It pulsed in every sidewalk, every subway, every skyscraper. It lived in the courage of his daughter. It lived in the reluctant penance of his destroyer. In the end, the truth had not only broken a man, it had remade the world.